Hi, Cancer. Wow, guys, the energy coming through already feels incredibly emotional. I have to be honest, the moment I started pulling these cards, it felt like someone has been carrying your absence much longer than they expected to. Because sometimes people think they can simply move on. They tell themselves they're fine. They stay busy. They distract themselves. They keep going. But then something small brings everything back, a memory, a song, a familiar place. And suddenly they're feeling something they thought had already faded. Okay. What I'm picking up here is the energy of someone who may be spending a lot more time thinking about you than they're letting on. It feels like they're beginning to notice just how much changed after you stepped back. Not because you disappeared. Not because you said anything dramatic. But because your presence used to be part of their world in ways they never fully appreciated at the time. And now, that quiet space where you once existed seems impossible for them to ignore. So let's take a look at what's coming through, because these cards are already telling quite a story. There's something about this energy that feels surprisingly quiet, not dramatic, not chaotic, just present. And as I look down at these cards, I keep getting the feeling that someone has been trying very hard to convince themselves they're okay, that they've moved on, that enough time has passed, that whatever this connection meant to them belongs in the past. But then the Six of Cups appears, and wow, the moment this card landed on the table, it felt like a door opening inside someone's memory. You know how certain moments seem completely ordinary when they're happening? A conversation, a laugh, a drive somewhere, a message you almost forgot about. And yet years later, those are the exact memories that come back when nobody invited them. That's what this feels like. It feels like someone unexpectedly finding themselves revisiting pieces of the past that they thought were long behind them. And for some reason, Cancer keeps appearing in those memories. Not necessarily because they're trying to think about you. Not necessarily because they're sitting around missing you all day. It's almost stranger than that. Because it feels involuntary. Like something keeps reminding them, a familiar song, a certain restaurant, a phrase someone says, a place they pass by without thinking, and suddenly your energy is there again. I have to be honest. This doesn't feel like someone who expected to still care this much. The Four of Swords sitting beside the Six of Cups feels important. Because what I'm sensing is someone spending more time alone with their thoughts lately. Maybe life has slowed down. Maybe distractions aren't working the way they used to. Maybe there are fewer voices around them than before. Whatever the reason, there seems to be more silence, and silence can be a very revealing thing. Because when everything becomes quiet, certain feelings become impossible to ignore. Feelings that once stayed hidden beneath responsibilities, beneath routines, beneath endless activity. And it feels like that's exactly what's happening here. The quiet is creating space to think, space to remember, space to notice what has changed. Because that's another thing that keeps coming through. The realization that life does not feel exactly the same anymore. Not worse, not better, just different. And sometimes that difference is difficult to explain. It's noticing an empty chair in a room you've walked through 1,000 times. You didn't think much about it at first. Then one day you realize you've been looking at that empty space every single time you enter the room. Okay. The Page of Swords is catching my attention now, and this card feels incredibly curious, almost restless. Like someone trying to understand something they don't fully understand yet. I keep feeling this energy of observation, reflection, wondering, questions without clear answers. Why does this still affect me? Why do these memories keep returning? Why am I thinking about this connection after all this time? For some of you, this could even feel someone occasionally checking in from a distance, not necessarily reaching out, not necessarily taking action, but watching, wondering, trying to understand where you are now, how you've changed, what your life looks like today. Because one thing that stands out here is that Cancer's absence seems to have created perspective. When people are constantly present, sometimes we don't fully notice their impact. We become accustomed to them. We assume they'll always be there. We assume we'll have more time, more opportunities, more conversations. But distance has a way of revealing things. And this energy feels like someone beginning to recognize aspects of this connection they may not have fully appreciated before. Not because they're suddenly seeing a fantasy, not because they're rewriting history, but because distance often removes distractions, and what's left behind feels easier to see. Wow, the Five of Cups just deepens this feeling even more, because beneath all these memories and reflections, there seems to be an emotional layer that hasn't completely disappeared. Something unresolved, something still being processed. And I don't mean regret in a dramatic sense. This feels softer than that, more reflective, more human. Like looking back at an old chapter and realizing there were moments you wish you had understood differently. moments you wish you had been more present for, moments that make more sense now than they did back then. You know, sometimes people don't fully understand the role someone played in their life until that person is no longer standing beside them. And that's the energy I keep feeling here. Not panic, not obsession, not desperation, just awareness, growing awareness, the kind that arrives slowly, the kind that unfolds through quiet evenings and unexpected memories, the kind that shows up when somebody realizes that certain feelings never truly disappeared. They simply became quieter for a while. And as I look back at the Six of Cups beside the Four of Swords, it almost feels like this person is standing between memory and understanding, trying to make sense of why your energy continues to surface, trying to understand why the story still feels unfinished somewhere deep inside them. And the more these cards settle on the table, the more it feels like those questions are only beginning to get louder. Because the more I sit with this energy, the less it feels like someone trying to understand what happened, and the more it feels like someone trying to understand themselves. The moon is the first card pulling my attention now, and I have to be honest, there's something about this card that feels incredibly personal, not because it's revealing answers, but because it's revealing questions. Questions that may have been sitting beneath the surface for a very long time. Questions they never allowed themselves to fully explore. Questions that were easier to avoid when life was moving quickly. Because sometimes people tell themselves a story about why something didn't work, a story about why they had to walk away, a story about why their choices made sense at the time. And for a while, that story feels convincing. It feels comfortable. It protects them from looking deeper. But what I'm seeing here is someone beginning to look beneath that surface. And once that process begins, it's difficult to stop. The moon almost feels like standing in a dimly lit room where familiar shapes suddenly look different. Not because the room changed, but because they're seeing it from a different perspective. You know, there may have been fears involved here that were never spoken out loud. Not necessarily dramatic fears. Sometimes the quiet fears are the ones that shape our choices the most. Fear of vulnerability, fear of disappointment, fear of making the wrong decision, fear of needing someone more than we planned to. And it feels like some of those fears may have quietly influenced this connection in ways they are only now beginning to recognize. Wow. The Seven of Cups appearing beside the moon feels significant, because there's a sense of looking back and realizing there were too many voices, too many possibilities, too many distractions, too much uncertainty. It's almost as if they spent so much time trying to figure out what could happen that they lost sight of what was actually happening. And when I say voices, I don't necessarily mean people speaking directly into their ear. Sometimes those voices come from expectations, old experiences, past disappointments, family influences, personal insecurities, things we carry around without even realizing how much power they have over us. I keep getting the feeling that there were moments when they weren't seeing this connection clearly. Not because they didn't care, not because they lacked feelings, but because they were viewing everything through layers of confusion that made it difficult to trust what they were experiencing. And that's where things become interesting, because confusion often feels convincing while we're inside it. Only later do we realize how much it distorted our perspective. Okay, justice arrives here almost like a pause, a long pause. The kind that happens when someone sits alone with their thoughts and begins reviewing their own decisions. Not judging themselves, not punishing themselves, just looking honestly, looking carefully, trying to understand cause and effect, trying to understand how certain choices created certain outcomes. And I keep feeling this quiet awareness growing, an awareness that some things weren't entirely outside their control, an awareness that certain crossroads required decisions they may not have been ready to make. Because one thing that keeps surfacing is the realization that circumstances alone didn't create distance. There were choices involved. Small choices, unspoken choices, moments of hesitation, moments of silence, moments where fear may have spoken louder than truth. And none of this feels like blame. It feels more like reflection. The kind of reflection that becomes possible only after enough time has passed. The kind that allows someone to see the bigger picture. I also feel as though they're beginning to understand how much outside influences affected their perspective. What other people thought, what other people expected, what other people believed was right. And perhaps for a long time, those influences seemed more important than they actually were. But distance has a way of stripping things down, removing noise, removing distractions, leaving only what genuinely matters. And that's where the Two of Swords enters this story. This card feels incredibly quiet, almost suspended, like someone standing between two truths. One truth they've lived with for a long time, and another truth they're only beginning to acknowledge. Neither side feels easy. Neither side feels comfortable. Because changing your perspective often means admitting you were looking at something differently before. And that's not always simple, especially when emotions are involved, especially when pride is involved, especially when memories continue resurfacing in ways you didn't expect. I keep feeling this internal conversation happening, a conversation nobody else hears, a conversation that seems to grow louder whenever things become still. What if I misunderstood certain things? What if fear influenced me more than I realized? What if I was protecting myself from something that actually mattered? What if there were things left unsaid that should have been spoken? Those questions don't feel fully answered yet. In fact, they feel very much alive, very much unfolding. And the energy here suggests that the deeper they look, the more layers they continue discovering. Because once someone begins questioning old assumptions, they often find themselves uncovering truths they never expected to find in the first place. Because once those questions begin surfacing, they rarely stay quiet for long. They tend to follow people into the safe spaces where there is nowhere left to hide. And that's exactly what this energy feels like. The Judgment card lands here, and the atmosphere around the reading shifts immediately. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that feels impossible to ignore. Almost like someone hearing an old song and suddenly understanding the lyrics differently than they ever did before. I have to be honest. This feels less like a person discovering something new and more like someone finally allowing themselves to acknowledge something that has been there all along, because sometimes awareness arrives in layers. The first layer is memory. The second layer is reflection. But eventually there comes a moment where reflection turns into recognition. And that moment can be incredibly uncomfortable, especially when certain truths have been waiting patiently beneath the surface. The Judgment card feels like one of those moments. A quiet realization, a pause, a deep breath, a feeling that says, I can't keep pretending I don't see this anymore. The Nine of Swords appears almost immediately beside it, and suddenly the energy becomes much more personal, much more intimate, because this doesn't feel like someone having these thoughts during the busy parts of the day. This feels like the hours nobody else sees, the moments when distractions finally stop working, the moments when a person is left alone with themselves. You know, there are certain questions that sound very different in silence, certain memories that become louder when there is no noise competing with them. And I keep feeling that some of those unanswered thoughts have been finding their way back recently, not because they want them to, not because they're trying to dwell on the past, but because unresolved emotions often have a way of resurfacing when they haven't been fully understood. It almost feels like they're replaying moments from a completely different angle now, noticing details they overlooked before, remembering conversations differently, recognizing emotions they may not have fully acknowledged at the time. And the strange thing is, the more they revisit these memories, the harder it becomes to dismiss them, because something about this connection continues to feel meaningful in a way they can't quite explain. The Hermit card is drawing my attention now, and this card feels incredibly important. Because while the Nine of Swords carries all of this emotional noise, the Hermit feels like someone stepping away from that noise, not to escape it, but to understand it. Okay, this feels like a period of deep internal searching. The kind of searching that happens when external answers stop satisfying you, when advice from friends no longer feels enough, when distractions lose their effectiveness, when staying busy no longer keeps certain thoughts away. I keep sensing someone becoming more honest with themselves than they've been in a very long time, not because anyone is forcing them, not because they're receiving pressure from outside sources, but because their own inner voice is becoming impossible to ignore. And that voice seems to be asking some difficult questions. Questions about choices, questions about timing, questions about fear, questions about what truly mattered and what only seemed important at the time. There is something incredibly vulnerable about this energy, because growth often requires us to sit with parts of ourselves we'd rather avoid, parts we thought we had already moved beyond, parts we convinced ourselves didn't matter anymore, and yet here they are, still present, still waiting to be understood. The moment the Tower appears, everything becomes even more interesting. Because this doesn't feel like chaos arriving from the outside. It feels like a shift happening internally, a shift in perspective, a shift in understanding, a shift in the story they've been telling themselves. And I have to be honest, sometimes the most powerful changes begin quietly, long before anybody else notices, long before any visible action takes place. The Tower here feels like an old belief beginning to crack, a belief that once felt solid, a belief that helped them make sense of things, but a belief that may no longer fit the reality they're starting to see. And when those cracks appear, new awareness often enters through them. Suddenly, things that once seemed obvious become uncertain. Things that once felt settled become worthy of another look. Feelings that seemed distant begin moving closer. The energy here doesn't feel finished. It feels active. Like someone standing in the middle of a personal awakening they haven't fully understood yet. Part of them seems to want clarity. Part of them's unsure what they'll discover if they keep looking deeper. But these cards suggest the process is already underway. Because once someone starts seeing themselves differently, once they begin seeing the past differently, once they begin seeing connection differently, it becomes very difficult to return to the version of the story they once believed without question. And as these cards continue settling on the table, it feels like even more layers are preparing to reveal themselves. Because sometimes the most meaningful realizations don't arrive through grand revelations. They arrive through contrast, through absence, through noticing what no longer exists where it once did. And that's the feeling washing over this reading as the Queen of Cups comes forward. I have to be honest, the energy shifts here in a way that feels surprisingly gentle. After all the questioning, all the inner searching, all the emotional noise we've been moving through, there is suddenly this feeling of softness. Not because everything has been figured out, not because all confusion has disappeared, but because something is becoming clearer, something about you, something about the role you played in their life. The Queen of Cups feels almost like a memory they are viewing through new eyes, not idealized, not exaggerated, just understood differently. Because when people are close to us every day, we sometimes overlook the things that make them special. Not intentionally, it simply becomes familiar, expected, part of the landscape of our lives. And what I keep sensing here is someone beginning to recognize qualities they once took for granted. The way you listened, the way you cared, the way you made space for them to be themselves, the way your presence often felt calming without even trying. You know, there are people who leave behind memories, and there are people who leave behind a feeling. This energy feels much more connected to the second one, because it doesn't seem like they're only remembering events. They're remembering how they felt around you, how conversations felt, how silence felt, how being understood felt, and sometimes those things become most visible after they're gone. Wow. The star appears and the atmosphere becomes even more reflective. There is something beautiful about this card showing up here, not because it promises anything, not because it's predicting anything, but because it feels connected to perspective, to appreciation, to seeing value where value already existed. And I keep feeling this growing awareness that some of the qualities they were searching for elsewhere may have already been present within this connection. Not in a perfect way, not in a fairy tale way, but in a real way, a human way. The kind of connection that doesn't always announce its importance while it's happening. The kind that reveals itself slowly over time. The kind that becomes easier to understand when life offers comparisons, because life has a way of teaching us what truly matters. Sometimes through experience, sometimes through distance, sometimes through loss. And there seems to be an increasing awareness here that what you brought into their life carried more weight than they originally understood. Okay, the Six of Pentacles is catching my attention now, and this card feels deeply connected to balance. Not necessarily balance between two people, but balance within their understanding. Because I keep sensing someone looking back and realizing things may not have been as equal as they once believed. Not from a place of guilt, not from a place of self-punishment, more from a place of honesty. Honesty about effort, honesty about consistency, honesty about emotional presence. Because when people revisit old chapters, they often begin noticing details they missed the first time around. Moments where someone showed up for them. Moments where someone extended patience. Moments where someone offered understanding. And what feels significant here is that these memories seem to be accumulating, one after another, creating a larger picture. A picture that continues reshaping how they view this connection, and perhaps even how they view you. I keep hearing the energy of appreciation. Not loud appreciation, not spoken appreciation, just quiet recognition. The kind that happens privately, the kind nobody else sees. The kind that slowly changes the way someone remembers a person. The Three of Pentacles feels incredibly important beside all of this, because there is a sense here of finally understanding what made this connection different. Not because it was perfect, not because there were no challenges, but because it seems to have contained something valuable that isn't always easy to find. Mutual growth, support, encouragement, a willingness to see potential in each other. And I have to be honest, that realization feels surprisingly emotional. Because some people only recognize the significance of a connection after enough time has passed for them to see its impact clearly. What stands out to me is that they don't appear to be focused solely on what they received. They seem increasingly aware of what was built, what was shared, what was created between two people, the small moments, the overlooked moments. The moments that felt ordinary at the time, but now seem filled with meaning. And perhaps that's why this energy feels so different from earlier parts of the reading. There is less confusion here, less resistance, less running, more understanding, more appreciation, more gratitude, not necessarily expressed outwardly, but felt internally. And the more these cards settle onto the table, the more it feels as though old misunderstandings are gradually giving way to something much quieter, something much softer, a deeper awareness of what was truly there all along. And that awareness seems to be opening a completely new chapter within their heart, one they may not have fully explored yet. A different kind of energy is moving through these cards now. Not the energy of looking backward. Not the energy of trying to understand what happened. This feels much more personal than that. Almost like someone standing in front of a mirror and realizing they can no longer keep carrying the same version of themselves into the future. The death card arrives first. And wow! The atmosphere around the reading becomes very quiet, not heavy, not frightening, just honest. Because sometimes growth begins when a person reaches the point where old habits stop feeling comfortable. Old excuses stop working. Old patterns stop making sense. And I keep feeling someone becoming increasingly aware of cycles they've repeated for years. Cycles that once felt familiar, cycles that once felt safe, but now feel limiting. You know, there comes a point in life when familiarity is no longer enough. A point where staying the same becomes more uncomfortable than changing. And that seems to be where this energy is leading. I have to be honest, this doesn't feel like someone changing because another person demanded it. It feels more like someone changing because they're beginning to recognize what certain choices have cost them. Not only in relationships, not only in love, but in their relationship with themselves. Because every time we avoid a difficult truth, a small part of us knows. Every time we walk away from something meaningful because fear feels easier than vulnerability, a small part of us remembers. And eventually those memories begin asking for attention. The death card feels like one of those moments. A realization that certain versions of ourselves cannot follow us where we're trying to go. Okay, the Eight of Cups appears beside it, and immediately I get the feeling of release. Not release in the sense that everything suddenly becomes easy, but release in the sense that someone is becoming willing to let go of things they once clung to. Old beliefs, old fears, old expectations, even old identities. Because sometimes people become attached to versions of themselves that no longer fit who they are becoming. The independent one, the guarded one. The one who never needs anyone, the one who keeps emotions hidden, the one who pretends everything is fine. And what feels important here is that these identities seem to be losing their grip, not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, naturally. As if this person is beginning to understand that some of the walls they built for protection may also have been keeping meaningful experiences out. There is something incredibly human about this energy, because growth often looks much quieter than people imagine. It's rarely one grand decision. It's usually 100 small moments, 100 moments of choosing honesty over avoidance, 100 moments of choosing awareness over denial, 100 moments of recognizing what truly matters, and that's exactly what I keep sensing. Small shifts happening beneath the surface. The Strength card is drawing my attention now. And what stands out to me is how different this feels from the kind of strength most people talk about. This isn't force. This isn't control. This isn't proving anything. It feels softer than that. More mature, more grounded. Like someone learning how to sit with uncomfortable emotions without immediately running from them. Learning how to remain present when things feel uncertain. Learning how to face parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding. Because I keep sensing a growing willingness to feel things honestly. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but honestly. And that kind of courage often creates deeper transformation than any dramatic action ever could. Wow. There is also a sense that this person is becoming less concerned with outside approval. Less concerned with expectations. Less concerned with fitting into someone else's version of success or happiness. Because one thing that keeps surfacing is exhaustion. Exhaustion from trying to be who other people expected them to be. Exhaustion from carrying roles that no longer feel authentic. Exhaustion from living according to standards that don't truly belong to them. And the more aware they become of that exhaustion, the more motivated they seem to be to create something different. Not for appearance, not for validation, but for peace, real peace. The kind that comes from alignment. The kind that comes from living honestly. The Temperance card settles onto the table and everything softens once again. I love the feeling of this card here. Because after all the internal movement we've been witnessing, there is finally a sense of integration beginning to take place. Not completion, not arrival, just balance slowly finding its way into places that once felt divided. Parts of themselves that were in conflict seem to be learning how to coexist. The side that wants security, the side that wants connection, the side that fears change, the side that longs for growth. Instead of fighting each other, these parts seem to be entering into conversation. And that's beautiful. Because true growth often begins when we stop treating ourselves like a problem to fix and start treating ourselves like someone worth understanding. I keep sensing someone becoming more compassionate toward their own journey, more patient with their own process, less interested in perfection, more interested in authenticity. And as these cards continue settling into place, it feels like this emerging version of them is still taking shape, still evolving, still discovering what matters most. But one thing seems increasingly clear. The path ahead no longer looks quite the same as the one they once believed they were supposed to follow. Something feels different here, not louder, not more dramatic, just more honest, as though all the layers we've been moving through have gradually brought someone closer to a truth they can no longer avoid. The Lover's card appears first, and immediately I feel a deep sense of clarity beginning to emerge. Not certainty, not conclusions, just clarity. The kind that develops when a person stops asking what they should feel and starts paying attention to what they actually feel. Because for a long time, it seems like this energy has been moving through questions. Questions about choices, questions about timing, questions about fears, questions about the past. But the Lovers feels less interested in questions and more interested in authenticity. You know, there comes a moment when people become tired of negotiating with their own heart, tired of explaining emotions away, tired of pretending certain feelings are less important than they really are. And I keep sensing someone reaching that point. Not because they suddenly woke up one day with all the answers, but because the answers have been slowly revealing themselves through every stage of this journey. I have to be honest. What feels most significant here is that this doesn't seem driven by fantasy. It doesn't feel like idealization. It feels much more grounded than that. Like someone recognizing the difference between fleeting attraction and meaningful connection. Recognizing the difference between what simply captures attention and what genuinely touches the soul. Wow. The King of Cups settles beside the Lovers, and the emotional maturity of this energy becomes impossible to ignore. Because earlier there were fears, there were uncertainties, there were things left unspoken. Now what I'm noticing is a growing willingness to sit with emotions rather than run from them. A willingness to acknowledge them without immediately trying to explain them away. And that is a powerful shift. Not because it changes everything overnight, but because it changes the relationship someone has with themselves. I keep feeling this quiet acceptance emerging. Acceptance of what mattered, acceptance of what was felt, acceptance of what continues to hold meaning. The King of Cups almost feels like someone learning how to trust their emotional world rather than fear it. Learning that vulnerability does not automatically create weakness. Learning that caring deeply about someone is not something that needs to be hidden or minimized. And perhaps most importantly, learning that emotions do not become less real simply because they were ignored. Sometimes they wait, sometimes they become quieter, but they remain present until they're acknowledged. Okay, the Ten of Cups is creating a very interesting atmosphere around the reading. Because it doesn't feel focused on the past. It feels focused on possibility, not specific outcomes, not guarantees, just possibility. The possibility of a life that feels more aligned. The possibility of making choices that reflect genuine values rather than old fears. The possibility of building something that feels emotionally fulfilling. And what stands out is that this vision seems increasingly connected to authenticity, not appearances, not expectations, not proving anything to anyone else. I keep sensing someone becoming more selective about what truly deserves their energy, more selective about what kind of future they want to create, more selective about which connections genuinely nourish their spirit. Because growth often changes our definition of happiness. Things that once seemed important begin losing their appeal. Things we once overlooked begin revealing their value, and that seems to be happening here. The more they understand themselves, the more they understand what actually matters. The Ace of Cups arrives with such a gentle energy, almost like the first light appearing before sunrise. Quiet, hopeful, tender, not demanding anything, not forcing anything, simply present. And I think that's what makes this card feel so meaningful. Because it suggests openness, a willingness to feel, a willingness to remain emotionally available to life, a willingness to stop living behind protective walls that no longer serve a purpose. I keep feeling that whatever this person is experiencing internally It has become increasingly difficult to dismiss. Not because someone is convincing them, not because outside circumstances are forcing them, but because something inside them has changed. Something has softened, something has opened, and when that happens, people often begin viewing everything differently. Old memories, old decisions, old relationships, even their own future. The Ace of Cups feels less like an ending and more like an invitation. An invitation to approach life from a more honest place. An invitation to trust what resonates deeply rather than what merely feels safe. An invitation to remain open to emotions that once felt uncomfortable. You know, sometimes the most meaningful transformations happen quietly. No grand announcement, no dramatic turning point, just a series of realizations that slowly reshape the landscape of someone's heart. And as I look at these cards together, there is a feeling that this inner journey is still unfolding, still revealing new layers, still teaching new lessons. Because the heart has a way of continuing the conversation long after the mind believes it has reached a conclusion. And something about this energy suggests that conversation is far from over, and those are the messages that came through today. If this reading resonated with you, take what feels meaningful and simply leave the rest behind. Remember, every connection unfolds differently, and only you truly know what speaks to your heart. Thank you for sharing this space with me and allowing me to read these cards with you. I always appreciate your time, your energy, and your presence here more than you know. Until our paths cross again, be gentle with yourself. Take care of your heart. Keep moving forward in the way that feels right for you. And if certain memories have been finding their way back lately, maybe they aren't here to pull you backward. Maybe they're simply helping you understand how far you've come. Thank you for being here. Sending you so much love. And I'll see you in the next reading. Bye for now.